Now, if you've been watching my channel for a while, you've likely heard me say that Mega Man is my favorite video game series. But if you've been really paying attention, you'll know that my actual favorite series is, in reality, Castlevania. Mega Man was a series I grew up with. It's a deeply rooted fixture of my childhood. By contrast, Castlevania was a series I really only got into as an adult, and therefore have a much more mature and sophisticated connection to the series, and I'm obscured by the rose-colored fog of nostalgia. But I'm hardly alone in this. Castlevania accounts for some of the most universally loved games on almost every single system it appeared on, with Castlevania 1 and 3 on the original Nintendo, Super Castlevania 4 on the Super Nintendo, Symphony of the Night on the PlayStation, Area of Sorrow on the Game Boy Advance, and take your pick from the trilogy of games on the Nintendo DS, because they're all fantastic. Granted, I don't love every game in the Castlevania series equally, but even the games I like the least are still B-tier games, high C-tier at the lowest, which isn't bad. But then you have the trilogy of games on the Game Boy, which, viewed as a whole, is one of the biggest stains on Castlevania's legacy. This is especially strange when you consider that these games appeared during what is arguably the strongest period in the Castlevania series. While Konami was producing hit after hit on the consoles, the same titles that would become some of the most esteemed games of all time, on the Game Boy it was a different story. Of these three games, only one is held in high regard. As for the other two, I don't think it's reasonable to even call them divisive. I think it's more accurate to say that they're just generally not very well liked. Granted, some people might argue that the worst games in this trilogy aren't really that bad, or that the best game is good enough to compensate for the shortcomings of the other two. And I might even be some people. So tonight, let's take a closer look at all the Castlevania games that appeared on the Nintendo Game Boy. Now here's a fun fact. Gargoyle's Quest was the first game Capcom released on the Game Boy. Konami's first Game Boy game, at least here in the United States, was Castlevania Adventure. Now, Castlevania Adventure is a bit of a divisive game, but it's easy to disparage the game when we have the benefit of looking back at the Castlevania series in its entirety, from its highs, of which there were a staggering number, to its lows, which were mercifully few but no less soul-crushing. Clearly, Castlevania Adventure is going to look bad when you compare it to Castlevania 3 or Symphony of the Night, but at the time, the only games we had to compare it to in the US were Castlevania 1 and 2. It goes without saying that Adventure falls to pieces when compared to the original Castlevania, but compared to Castlevania 2? Yeah, that's a tough call. Let me think about that. There are a bunch of reasons why people don't like this game. For one, it's incredibly slow. Now, there was likely a reason for this. They were probably just doing everything they could to reduce the motion blur. But no matter how reasonable the explanation, Castlevania Adventure is noticeably sluggish. Also, Castlevania Adventure is really weird. This game is like an AI interpretation of the Castlevania series as described by Sloth from The Goonies. And he doesn't know anything about Castlevania. It's a bizarro universe where all the staircases have been replaced by ropes, and instead of skeletons and Medusa heads, the stages are filled with giant rolling eyeballs and creepy somersaulting caterpillars, and I don't know, whatever the hell these things are. It's a strange world where hearts refill your health instead of charging your sub-weapons, because there are no sub-weapons, or wall meat for that matter. In fact, the only recognizable elements from the NES Castlevania games are the Belmont character and Dracula. And that's assuming you can even make it far enough in the game to see Dracula, because the other thing people hate about this game is that it is relentlessly punishing. Just like the original Castlevania, you can power up your whip twice to extend your reach and the damage you inflict. The third power level even shoots a little fireball from the end of your whip. That's pretty cool. But unlike the original Castlevania, taking any damage at all will kick you back down to the previous power level. Compounding this is the game's tendency to crowd the screen with enemies and projectiles, especially these guys, screw these bastards, that are almost impossible to avoid or take out effectively because of the sluggish controls. And before you know it, you're back to the plain vanilla leather whip and struggling to hold your own in the levels. And that's to say nothing about the janky platforming, where you have to be hanging almost completely off the edge of platforms in order to just barely make a jump. Or an entire stage where you are constantly pursued by a wall of spikes where even one tiny mistake is an immediate death. Castlevania Adventure is an extremely short game. It's only 4 stages long, but it fights against you the entire way. It is wholeheartedly committed to not letting you finish the game. So with all this considered, when people talk about how terrible this game is and how much they hate it, I have to say, you guys are crazy. I actually really like Castlevania Adventure. No, it's not the best game, but it's pretty darn good. Yes, it's slow. Christopher Belmont just trudges through this game like he's wading through peanut butter. But it's also very brief, which means there isn't a whole lot of game here to trudge through. There isn't a whole lot of game here to learn. Besides, the slower pace almost works to your advantage sometimes, allowing you to take your time and prepare yourself for that pixel-perfect jump you have to make, or that enemy you have to strike or dodge at just the right moment. The enemies are strange, sure, but I think that gives Adventure its own identity, its own unique feel. The lack of staircases feels a bit off-brand, but realistically, stairs on the Game Boy screen would just take up too much room. Using ropes to move between screens and platforms was a perfectly reasonable concession to make. And on that note, regardless of how you feel about this game, you can't deny that Konami absolutely nailed it with the character size. Christopher Belmont's sprite is large enough to be unmistakable as a classic Castlevania protagonist, and yet small enough that it more or less mimics the character-to-screen ratio from the full console games. This in particular was a very tricky balance for developers to make. Very few of them ever really got it right. But Konami hit it out of the park pretty much right from the get-go. And speaking of hitting it out of the park, this game's soundtrack is one of the best you'll ever hear on the Game Boy. Damn, that's good stuff. I won't try to convince anyone that Castlevania Adventure is a great game, because obviously it's got its flaws. But if you're patient, and maybe more than a little bit forgiving, there's a perfectly enjoyable game here that is worth experiencing. And it also provided a solid foundation for its sequel, which built upon all of Adventure's best aspects and smoothed over all the rough edges. In short, for a Castlevania game without any skeletons, Castlevania Adventure still has some really good bones. The Game Boy's trilogy of Castlevania games is one of the most polarized video game series of all time. Castlevania Adventure is reviled for its painfully slow and unforgiving gameplay, and how savagely unwelcoming it is to new players. Castlevania Legends, which concluded the trilogy, is considered by many people to be even worse than Castlevania Adventure. However, these two titles bookend a game that is more or less universally liked by everyone: Castlevania II: Belmont's Revenge. Belmont's Revenge builds upon the foundation laid by its predecessor, Castlevania Adventure, and it addresses every complaint people had about that first game. The game moves much faster and its controls are tighter. It brings back series mainstays like sub-weapons, hearts, and hidden wall meat. Its difficulty is far more forgiving. There are fewer instances of instant death traps, and even the trickier stage elements are telegraphed much more clearly to the player. And possibly most importantly, you no longer lose your whip power-ups from taking a single hit. Only one enemy in the game can rob you of your whip upgrades, and even these things are easier to deal with this time around. The game opens with a Mega Man-esque stage selection screen, allowing you to play the first 4 castle stages in any order. Although these stages are no cakewalk, the difficulty is balanced pretty evenly across all 4 castles, and learning to get good at the game doesn't feel like as much of a grind when you are free to practice any of these starting stages at any time. Once all 4 castles have been destroyed, Dracula's castle finally appears, and the final set of stages play out in a linear fashion. It's also worth noting that the game uses a password system to save your progress, so you no longer need to finish the entire game in a single sitting. Belmont's Revenge is an extremely good-looking game too, which is honestly pretty typical of most, but not all, Konami games on the Game Boy. The art style is especially strong, making each stage feel distinct and memorable, from the pulsing organic growths of the plant castle to the Egyptian-inspired architecture of the rock castle, to the more traditional clock tower mechanisms of the cloud castle. Now, one positive aspect of Castlevania Adventure that I think everyone could agree on was its music, and Belmont's Revenge follows suit with a soundtrack that is every bit as strong, if not better. As I mentioned earlier, Belmont's Revenge is not nearly as difficult as Castlevania Adventure, or at least not as frustrating. However, there's one severe difficulty spike towards the end of the game, and if you've played this game, you know exactly what part I'm talking about. This boss fight against Christopher Belmont's son is hands down the most difficult part of the game. This feels like the true final boss battle, as the confrontation that follows with Dracula himself is almost trivial by comparison. Castlevania II Belmont's Revenge is a perfect sequel. It expands on everything I had loved about Castlevania Adventure and concisely cuts out everything I disliked about it. And to say that this is the best Castlevania game on the Game Boy doesn't do it justice. I think it's more fair to say that Belmont's Revenge deserves to stand with the very best games in the Castlevania series in its entirety. In a discussion about games to play during the Halloween season, what could be more fitting than the Castlevania series? Answer: Kid Dracula. I can honestly say that I wish Kid Dracula was indeed more Halloween appropriate. But I'm not going to hold that against the game. I don't believe they were actually trying to make a game that had the same Halloween feels as any of the proper Castlevania games. But Kid Dracula is Castlevania adjacent, so it frequently gets lumped in with games that do a far better job at representing the spooky season. But I'm getting ahead of myself. If you aren't familiar, Kid Dracula originally debuted in 1991 as a Famicom game called Akumaju Special Boku Dracula-kun, which roughly translates to Demon Lord Special I'm Kid Dracula. It was a lighthearted game that very loosely parodied the Castlevania series, similar to how the Parodius series was a parody of Gradius. In fact, Dracula-kun even appeared as a playable character in one of the Parodius games. Also, like Parodius, Dracula-kun was not released in the United States, probably because it was full of that wonderful Japanese humor and weirdness that, despite being extremely popular in America now, definitely wasn't as appreciated back then. However, a lot can change in 2 years. In 1993, someone apparently decided that America was finally ready for Dracula-kun, and so the Game Boy sequel was brought to the US, simply called Kid Dracula. Now, just to get this out of the way, there seems to be some debate over whether Kid Dracula is the literal child form of Dracula, or if he's Dracula's son, who canonically would be Alucard. I'm of the opinion, however, that Kid Dracula is a separate character who exists in whatever parallel Konami universe the Parodius series exists in, and we're probably not meant to think too hard about how he fits into the Castlevania series. And yes, I know there were some tongue-in-cheek references to Kid Dracula in Symphony of the Night, but to me this isn't any real confirmation of any connection between the two series, but I will look forward to hearing what you guys think in the comment section. The Game Boy game follows the events of the Famicom game. Galamoth, who was the antagonist of the original game, has returned, and Kid Dracula wants to defeat him. The game opens with a very basic recreation of Dracula's castle, complete with classic Castlevania staples like spike traps and rotating gears, and even the stage theme is a playful remix of Beginning from Castlevania 3. Kid Dracula attacks enemies with a fireball that he can shoot in 4 directions, and holding down the fire button will let him charge up his attack and unleash a super fireball, which of course does extra damage. Enemies defeated with a charge attack will drop coins, which you can use between levels to play minigames to earn extra lives. After every level, Kid Dracula will gain an additional special ability, like a spread shot that will home in on enemies, or the ability to flip gravity and walk on the ceiling. Pressing the select button will let you cycle through your special abilities, but in this first stage, the only special Kid Dracula can do is transform into a bat and fly freely around the screen for a limited time. Now, once you get through the opening stage, the game quickly begins to shed any resemblance to the Castlevania series. The second stage is presumably the forest outside the castle, guarded by what appears to be Rick from the Splatterhouse games. After that, you'll go through an amusement park, a flying pirate ship, an elevator into space, a volcano planet straight out of Gradius, and finally some kind of mechanical castle/robot factory, at the end of which we'll finally face Galamoth. Now, I'll just state the obvious. This is a very good-looking game. Character sprites are chunky and well-drawn and pop out in stark contrast against the backgrounds. All the stages feel spacious and open without feeling sparse or empty. And in spite of the rather minimalistic stage design, the art style is very strong all throughout the game. I'd normally have a gripe or two about how large the characters appear on the screen, but in this case, I never felt like the sprites were too big. There were never any moments where I felt like the zoomed-in perspective was a liability. Granted, this is likely because the game runs so slowly that you usually have plenty of time to react to stage obstacles. Kid Dracula himself moves at a plodding, almost sluggish pace, about on par with the underwater physics in a Sonic the Hedgehog game. And the game's pacing is also kind of broken. After you complete each stage, there's often an expository cutscene between Kid Dracula and one of the other characters, as well as a full demonstration of whatever new ability has been unlocked. And then there's a minigame selection screen where you can spend your coins to earn extra lives, which is made even more drawn out because even the process of selecting a minigame is itself a minigame. And at last you're shown the overworld map, which allows you to finally move on to the next stage. Now, don't take these complaints to mean that I dislike Kid Dracula or that I wouldn't recommend playing it. Kid Dracula has a great personality, and its clean and cartoony presentation is undeniably appealing. But the culmination of all these issues make the game a little boring to play. It's a nice enough game to spend an afternoon with, but not one I've been motivated to play very often. Castlevania 2 Belmont's Revenge appeared on the Game Boy in the summer of 1991, and it was received very well. After that, though, the series pretty much went into hibernation, on the Game Boy at least. If we zoom out though, the Castlevania series on a whole continued to thrive on the home consoles, with Super Castlevania 4 on the Super Nintendo in 1991, the Japan-only Rondo of Blood for the PC Engine in 1993, Bloodlines for the Sega Genesis in 1994, and in 1995 we got an altered port of Rondo of Blood for the Super Nintendo called Dracula X. And finally, at the end of 1997, the Castlevania series moved to the Sony PlayStation, with Symphony of the Night. Castlevania Legends released in the US in early 1998, which was possibly the worst possible time for the game to come out. We were deep into the 5th console generation at this point, and the Game Boy was looking pretty archaic next to the PlayStation, Nintendo 64, and Sega Saturn. Sales numbers for the Game Boy had been in steady decline since 1993, and the number of games being released had slowed to a trickle. There were less than 20 games released between March of 97 and 98, and even though a handful of recent high-profile releases had kept the Game Boy somewhat relevant, we were still a ways off from the massive surge in popularity the Game Boy would see when Pokemon came out later that year. Castlevania Legends wasn't received with much fanfare either. Nintendo Power gave it a very lukewarm 6.4 out of 10, and Electronic Gaming Monthly gave it a below average score of 4.75 out of 10. What's worse, despite being developed as a prequel to the entire Castlevania series, Legends has been decanonized by Konami and, as far as I know, has not been referenced in any of the other games. The first time I played Castlevania Legends was in the summer of 2012, and full disclosure, I was extremely sick with a summer flu at this time, and honestly should not have been attempting to play any game for the first time, because I was not in a position to enjoy anything, let alone a game that had significant flaws that were immediately apparent as soon as the game began, like the way it looks and the way it sounds. This negative association I created between Castlevania Legends and the dark, miserable week of nausea and feverish night sweats was so strong that I had no interest in revisiting the game for the next 13 years, which I can freely admit was not entirely fair to the game. Now, having finally played through this game multiple times, I can still say with some honesty that it's probably not a game I'll ever be compelled to play again. But at the same time, it's not a bad game. So the remainder of this review will probably just be me excusing Castlevania Legends for its many, many flaws, which is honestly not a position I expected to take when I started playing this game for this video. So like I was saying earlier, Castlevania Legends is meant to be a prequel to the entire Castlevania franchise. You play as Sonia Belmont in the first confrontation between the Belmont clan and Dracula. At some point in the game, you'll run into Alucard, and it's heavily implied that he and Sonia are romantically involved, which would make him the father of the unnamed child seen at the end of the game, and by extension, the forefather of all the Belmont characters who have appeared in every other Castlevania game. I imagine it was specifically this detail that caused Castlevania Legends to be Thanos snapped out of the Castlevania timeline. But I actually don't have a problem with this. This honestly makes a whole lot more sense than the utter nonsense they came up with for the Lords of Shadow series. Within the context of being the first Castlevania game, there's some nice logic to how Legends strays from the typical Castlevania formula. Sonya does the typical Castlevania stuff like whipping candles to collect hearts, but there are no sub-weapons in the game, not in the traditional sense at least. You can find the classic Castlevania sub-weapons in secret areas throughout the game, but these are just Easter eggs. You had to find all of them to see the true ending to the game, so in a sense, it could be seen as Sonya symbolically unlocking each of these items so they can continue to appear for future members of the Belmont clan. Another detail I think is kind of neat is that after defeating Medusa later in the game, her head kind of flies off screen, implying that Sonya's actions have created one of the most notorious enemies in the entire Castlevania series. Instead of sub-weapons, Sonya gains what the game calls a soul weapon every time she defeats a stage boss, and these become selectable like the weapons in a Mega Man game. One ability will allow you to freeze enemies for several seconds, and another will completely refill your health bar. There's a weapon that will damage all the enemies on the screen, and another that lets you throw a fireball, which is kind of redundant since that's also what the fully powered up whip lets you do. And the last power you receive will let you destroy all the enemies on the screen. Now, as you can imagine, these abilities, as long as you have the hearts available to use them, make Legends a much easier game than most other entries to the series. Sonya is also much more agile than your typical Castlevania protagonist, in that she can still freely move during a jump like any normal video game character, instead of being locked into a rigid jump arc like in the other games. Sonya also has a special move called Burning Mode, whereby pressing A and B together, she'll essentially go Super Saiyan for about 10 seconds, making her invincible and able to move faster. You can only use this once per life per stage, but it pretty much trivializes every boss fight in the game. There are 6 levels in the game, although one of them is a secret area that requires a completely untelegraphed leap of faith to access. There's not really a lot of innovation in the design of these stages or the mechanics within them. Generally, these are all very basic, by-the-numbers Castlevania levels, but they're all quite large and filled with branching paths, and your exploration is rewarded with extra lives, health refills, or those aforementioned sub-weapon tokens. Castlevania Legends is a much better game than I expected, but it still has a number of nagging issues that keep it from being great. The graphics are not very good. Most of the characters look like primitive stick figures drawn in Microsoft Paint. The stages and backgrounds are very basic and uninteresting to look at. There's unfortunately none of the lush details or animations that we saw in Belmont's Revenge. Considering how late this game came out on the hardware and how far Game Boy games had come by this time, it's disappointing that Legends actually looks worse than Castlevania Adventure, which was one of the first games created for the Game Boy. Legends isn't a particularly difficult game, but it is kind of annoying. Sonya's whip strike is about half of what it is in the previous games, which may not be too much of an issue when you're fully powered up and can throw that fireball, but unless you can make it all the way through the game without dying, you can't always count on having that fireball attack. There's also a surprising amount of verticality to the game that you really don't have a good way to deal with. A lot of enemies come at you from above, often at such sharp angles that it's difficult to hit them with your whip before you take a hit. One of the game's favorite tricks is to surprise you with annoyingly placed enemies as you're climbing or platforming up through vertically oriented areas. And it's easy to get trapped in a situation where a bat or a ghost knocks you downward during a tricky jump, only to respawn immediately as you start climbing back up and then knock you back down again. Granted, once you have it, you can use the wind ability to freeze enemies long enough to get into a better position to deal with them, but these were the main instances where I would have liked to have had at least one proper sub-weapon to augment Sonya's attacks. Castlevania Legends is far from a perfect game, but it's still good enough that I think it definitely deserved better treatment from Konami when it first came out. I'm not sure what the general opinion of this game is now, but the impression I've gotten is that it has become a little more appreciated in recent years. Between the two of them, I still prefer Castlevania Adventure, but Legends is definitely the better game. Oh, and it also has Super Game Boy support. Now, before I wrap this up, I'd like to say a few words about the lasting impact of the Game Boy's Castlevania series, which honestly won't take too long. Compared to other Game Boy exclusive entries to established series like Metroid 2, the Mega Man games, and Konami's own Operation C, all of which had some influence on the games that preceded them, the Game Boy's Castlevania series pretty much exists in a vacuum. The signature elements of these games, such as the rope climbing and the fireball whip, have remained more or less exclusive to just these 3 games. Although Circle of the Moon and Harmony of Dissonance from the Game Boy Advance each included the Fireball Whip as an optional power-up, Castlevania Adventure and Castlevania 2 have been re-released a number of times. They were both included in the Konami GB Collection, which was a series of 4 compilations of Konami's Game Boy games that was only published in Japan and Europe. Curiously, Castlevania Adventure was the only game in the series to appear on the 3DS's Virtual Console, but both games were included in the multi-platform Castlevania Anniversary Collection in 2019. Castlevania Legends, on the other hand, has only gotten 1 re-release. It's currently available on the Switch Online service, although this version does not include the Super Game Boy features like the custom color palette and wallpaper. Kid Dracula has never gotten a re-release. It was not included on any of the Konami GB cartridges. It was not released on the 3DS's Virtual Console. It wasn't included in the Castlevania Anniversary Collection, even though the Famicom version was. And as of the time of this writing, it has not been added to the Switch's online Game Boy library. The closest it got to a re-release was as a digital download for the Nintendo Power Flash memory cartridge, only in Japan. Now this is all well and good, of course, but I imagine the game you've been waiting for me to mention is Castlevania Adventure Rebirth, which released in 2009 exclusively on the Nintendo Wii. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking that this was a remake of the original Game Boy game. After all, it is called Castlevania Adventure Rebirth. However, this was an original Castlevania game that just compiled elements from a variety of games from the larger Castlevania series, only one of which was actually Castlevania Adventure. The only references to Castlevania Adventure are the Fireball Whip, which is now just a temporary power-up, and the game's bestiary, which includes enemies from the original game, like the Scythe Thrower, the Giant Spear Knights, the Somersaulting Worms, and of course tons and tons of rolling eyeballs. However, this iconic enemy, which in the original game was clearly an actual creature with eyeballs and teeth, has been reimagined as some sort of plant or fungus. None of the game's stages are based on any of the levels from Castlevania Adventure, and the game's soundtrack is composed of selections from other Castlevania games. Castlevania Adventure's music was absolutely the best part of the game. It truly boggles the mind that they wouldn't use it in something they were trying to pass off as a remake. Now, Castlevania Adventure Rebirth is a really good Castlevania game, but it's more of a celebration of the Castlevania series in its entirety. It has very little in common with the specific game it takes its name from. As of right now, Castlevania Adventure Rebirth is the last classic-style Castlevania game that Konami has ever published, and it has not been re-released on any other platforms. Hey, you're still here. Well, thank you for watching all the way to the end. If you liked this video and you're feeling up to it, go ahead and do all the YouTube-y stuff that I'm supposed to ask you to do. Have a great night, and I will see you in the next video. You know, so to speak.